Good everyone. Welcome to the Fleetform Wednesday webinar. Today we're going to talk about electric vehicles, lessons learned from the electric vehicle project we run this moment in Middle East, some Middle East and African countries, and some tips, guidance on where to look at if you consider or have decided that you want to like to deploy electric vehicles within your organization. As most of you will know, is we have a chat function here. So it would be good if you can let us know your name, the organization you work for, the country you're from, so we can see who is in the call, in the webinar, I would say. Yeah, Bo is there, very good. So at least that's a good indication that you can hear me. Yeah, very good. Mary's there, Moses, great. Yeah, just continue typing, let's say, where you're from, and your name and your organization. That gives us a bit of an idea on who we have in the call. In the meantime, I will share my screen to start the actual webinar. In the meantime, you will receive or will have received an invitation to join the tool that allows you to have a translation, subtitled. So my language in English will then be translated in your preferred language. Okay. So electric vehicles in the Middle East and Africa. So what we are doing at the moment is we're running a project which started already in 2022. And at the moment, we work with 6 different organizations and 36 vehicles that we follow, that we monitor, that we collect data from in 6 different countries. And the idea is that we learn from working together, from collecting data, collecting experiences, doing surveys, to see what is the impact of deployment of electric vehicles. And the project, so early next year, we will publish some guidance next to the guidance that already has been published. I will come to that later, and training material for organizations who would like to deploy electric vehicles as well. I would be interested to see, so do you already, let's say, planned or decided to use electric vehicles? So let me launch a quick poll and to give a bit of an idea on where you are. So did you or your organization already decide that you said, yes, we're going to procure 1 or more electric vehicles? Is that a yes? Is that a no? Or is that, well, we're not sure yet. We are still considering. It would be interesting to see how your organization is looking at it. And it also gives you a bit of an idea on what for you the reason is to let's say, to participate, to join this webinar. So I see that most of you answered. Some more come in. Yeah, give it a little more time because some more people come in and let's say answer the poll. Yeah, okay. So I will end the poll and show you the results. And what you see here is that the majority, so almost half of the organizations here in the webinar already decided to procure one. About 1/4, 27% said, no, we did not make a decision. And about the same amount of organizations, yes, we are considering. So I would say, compared to, if we would have asked this question 2 years ago, then probably the majority would say, well, no, are we still considering? And now you see that more and more organizations are seriously looking into it. And as we see, almost 50% already made the decision to use electric vehicles. Okay. So what do you expect? Even if it's no or we are considering, what do you expect in 2 years from now? Do you expect that your organization will use electric vehicles? Yeah, let me see. So we see here, oh, yeah. Little while to see if the majority of you think, well, this is something that we will use as well. That's something that we will not stop. So we see here that so more than 80%, 81% of you says, yes, we expect in the next 2 years, my organization will deploy electric vehicles. Still 20% says, no, I don't think that our organization will do so, you know, and both decisions, I would say, are right, as long as you use the right information to make, let's say, a well thought decision. Okay. So let's look into, let's say, the start before you think about electric vehicles. So what we call the adoption phase. So why do you as an organization, or what do we want an electric vehicle? It can be part of a transformation program for the organization to move into, let's say, a greener fleet, or in general, reduce environmental impact, reduce emissions. But we also see it that it can be a quite complex decision-making process. Maybe it's good to start is because if we talk about electric vehicles, then we think that there are always 2 steps before. So there's an avoid, there's a shift, and improve. So avoid is, well, can you do anything possible to just not use a vehicle? Right? What we've always said is the cleanest kilometer driven is the kilometer you don't drive. So if you look at your transport demand and you can do something to, let's say, don't have that demand, that's always the best, because then you don't have travel. Shift is then, can you do it to a more environmental friendly way? If you still have to, let's say you have a transport demand, can you use public transport, or you do vehicle sharing or carpooling? So you reduce the number of vehicles by at least 50%. You can walk or cycle, or you use other mobility services. That's the first steps that you always need to take. If you say, well, now we still need a vehicle, then look at how you can do it in the optimum way. And electric mobility is one of the ways that you can use to improve your fleet. Okay. So before you make a decision on the type of electric vehicle that you would like to use, it's important that you have a good insight in your transport demand. What is it that I need a vehicle for? And what is it where I need an electric vehicle for? So you look into mostly urban environments where you can use an electric vehicle, where you would normally use a 2-wheel drive, a city vehicle maybe, to look into what your transport demand is there. Deploying an electric vehicle means that you need to have a high utilization. You will see later in the webinar that there is, let's say, in many cases, an electric vehicle is more expensive, and it has a higher emissions in the production phase. If we look at the cost of driving an electric vehicle, it's much lower. Maintenance is much lower. Energy cost is much lower than fuel. So that means that from a cost perspective, you need to drive as many kilometers as possible. Might sound strange if you think about the avoid, but at least you need to ensure that you really need the vehicle for a certain amount of kilometers to, let's say, compensate for the higher purchase price. And the same for the carbon emission related to the production. You will compensate that by using it and having 0 to hardly carbon emissions. So you need to ensure that the vehicle is really needed and it will have a high utilization. you need to look into the local context. So whether you work with a global framework agreement or with local suppliers, it's important that you have a very clear understanding of on the warranty and the after sales provided. What we see is that the number of electric vehicles available in, let's say, well, in this case, Middle East, Africa, is limited. There are suppliers. We know Care & Care, one of our members, provides electric vehicles. There are some more organizations who do that, but you need to ensure that you still have the warranty and you have the after sales as well. Secondly, you have to look at the grid in your country. There's a huge difference. For example, in two countries where we deploy electric vehicles, in Kenya, let's say, where around 85% of the grid, the electricity from the grid is renewable from renewable energy, or Lebanon, where most electricity is produced by coal power plants. So the emissions from, let's say, related to the energy production in Lebanon is much higher than in Kenya. And as you charge your vehicle with electricity from the grid, most of the time, unless you use solar, then you have to take that into account. And another important point is, do you have, sorry, a facility to charge? And if not, can you set up a facility to charge? You know, in many cases, organizations talk, or people talk about, we need an infrastructure, or there's no charging infrastructure in many countries. To be honest, I don't think you need a charging infrastructure. What you need is that you need a charging station, because in most cases, the vehicle will come back to the office in the evening. So you always have time to charge in one location. So even if there's no infrastructure in the country, charging infrastructure, you can still use, let's say, one charging station to charge your vehicle. Then, you know, how do you look at the decision on whether what type of vehicle to use? Well, this is a great example of ICSC, how they use it internally, the different type of vehicles for different purposes, and looking at the cost, total cost of operation, the carbon emission, and the safety rating. Because they say, well, that's are the three main, let's say, indicators that we use to decide on what type of vehicles we use. So when they say the electric vehicle, you see it at the right side, it's very safe, is the best if you look at emission ratings in use, and has a fairly low operating cost as well. So this is not to say, oh, we always do, let's say, heavy-duty 4x4, or we always do electric vehicles, but it gives a guidance internally to fleet managers in countries is when do you choose what vehicle and what is the impact on it of that vehicle on emissions, on cost, and on safety rating. So some two other topics I think that we sort of covered already, but let's run through it once more, is the right profiling. So what you see is that OEMs, so car manufacturers, tend to produce and propose bigger and bigger batteries. They become bigger and bigger and bigger because they say, well, you have a higher range. What we see in organizations when they buy a vehicle is that they also tend to follow that trend and buy vehicles with a big battery in it. The question is whether you need that large battery. In some cases you might, but if you, let's say, drive the vehicle mainly in and around town, and you don't drive more than 100 kilometers a day, then a small battery will definitely do, is sufficient. You don't need that big battery, because the big battery means higher costs. The big battery means more carbon emission, let's say, in the production, and a bigger battery also means a more heavier vehicle, so your energy use will go up. So really look very critical to what is the range that you need to prevent buying an oversized electric vehicle. what we discussed. The market availability is limited still. And more countries it is possible to procure an electric vehicle, but not everywhere. So you really need to look at what's available and very specifically look at what's the after sales that's being offered, what's the warranty that's being offered, because that's important before you make a decision. And then you have to make a decision whether you do use a global framework agreement from your organization or you procure locally. Then the charger is part of the procurement challenge, I would say. It's not like, oh, if you buy an electric vehicle, the charger comes with it. It's most of the time a separate procurement process, and you have to ensure that you have the right charger, and it's also, let's say, that the charger is there when the vehicle arrives. So the moment that the vehicle arrives, you are able to charge, let's say, the vehicle as well. So that's something to take into account, that the moment you start a procurement process for a vehicle, you also start the procurement process for a charger. And looking at lead times, maybe you have to start earlier with the charger than with the vehicle, but really you have to discuss that upfront with different suppliers. Then the use phase, charging. It's important that you have the right charger which matches with the vehicle. So different vehicles require different types of chargers. Then you can also look at, do you want a smart charger? A smart charger, for example, is it charges during the day only, or during the evening only, or at the moment that electricity is cheaper than at another moment. It charges only at the moment that, let's say, the demand for energy is lower. So a smart charger really looks into what's the optimum moment to charge the vehicle. Then data tracking, especially if you have more than one electric vehicle and you use one charger, you want to know how many energy was charged per vehicle. Like you do now with fuel, you know how much fuel is being used in your vehicles. The same, you need to do that for your electric vehicles, but you need to have a tool, something to take into account when you, let's say, procure a charger that is able to track, let's say the energy charged in your vehicle. Okay. So then you start using the vehicle. And it is interesting because an electric vehicle is not just another vehicle. It's a really different vehicle. So you need to train your drivers, for example. But let's look, the first one that we see a lot with organizations is range anxiety. What we see is that despite the fact that the range of the vehicle should be, let's say, around 200 kilometers, is that we still see that if we look at all the trips of an organization, of the, let's say, the city cars and electric vehicle, the electric vehicle is always the vehicle with the trips with a lower amount of kilometers. So when the trip is a bit longer, then you see that organizations tend to allocate a vehicle with an engine instead of the electric vehicle, where actually it should be the other way around, because in the use phase, an electric vehicle does not have emissions. In the use phase, electric vehicle is much cheaper. So you would do it the other way around. So for the longer trips, you allocate an electric vehicle. And even if you have 100 kilometers, a 100-kilometer trip, a range of 200 kilometers will definitely do. But what we see is we have to take people by the hand and really convince them that range, you can rely on the range of the vehicle. And so prevent range anxiety, because that means that the vehicle is being used less than you would like to. For that, you need a good journey planning. So really look, what are the different trips I need to make? And for what trips do I use what vehicle? And a charging plan, of course, if you know, okay, today I have a trip of 150 kilometers, tomorrow 100, that means I need to charge my car in the evening. And if I have more than one vehicle and only one charger, you need to have a schedule on what vehicle can be charged when. And then looking at drivers, like I said, an electric vehicle is different than another vehicle. For example, it has some specific features like regenerative braking. That means if you use the vehicle in the right way, you don't hardly have to brake yourself. It brakes because the vehicle brakes itself. And while doing that, it regenerates energy. So it loads your vehicle actually again by braking while driving it. The eco-driving is different as well. The eco-driving practices are different than from a petrol or diesel engine vehicle. So you need to train your drivers in what does it mean to drive an electric vehicle. And then there's some pretty cool, nice features in electric vehicles, like the sport mode. Well, it's better to disable that because that means that it's let's say the energy consumption goes up substantially, actually. Okay. And then after the use phase, well, there's an end of life, and the difference, let's say, between ICE and an electric vehicle is, of course, this huge battery of it. What we see is that organizations and fleet management is still very much focused on the use phase. And it would be interesting and important to discuss it with manufacturers as well, or with distributors or so. How can they support you at the end of the life of the vehicle? And what we see now actually is that only 5% of batteries are recycled, and that number should definitely go up. So make that part of the discussion that you have with the supplier. Also, how can you support us in the end of life of an electric vehicle? Okay. So electric vehicles are being used because it can support your objective as an organization to reduce emissions of your operations. So we worked together with Cord and the Kuehne Logistics University, and they did a study, a life cycle assessment on the environmental comparison, the environmental performance comparison between electric vehicles and vehicles with an engine. And so they looked at all kinds of environmental impact, not just carbon emissions, but all other emissions like water pollution, air pollution. So they looked at everything that you can imagine from the perspective of environmental, let's say, impact. And well, what you see here at the left side is if you look at production and disposal, then an electric vehicle, the carbon emissions related to production and disposal of an electric vehicle is substantially higher than of a comparable vehicle with an ICE. If you look at the heavy duty 4x4, it has even more than an electric vehicle. But in fact, what you should do is compare the electric vehicle with another city vehicle, mid-sized one. Then you see that the carbon emission of the electric vehicle is much higher. But you also see is that while using it, and you see that at the right side, so the use phase is the dark blue, I would say, is that, let's say, on the use phase, the carbon emission of electric vehicles is much lower because you don't have carbon emissions while driving. The carbon emissions come from the production of the electricity. So that's why, if you look here, is that the more kilometers you drive, the better it is to use electric vehicles because then you compensate for the higher carbon emissions at the production. Well, it's also interesting to see here that you see big differences between, for example, Kenya and Lebanon. Like we said, big difference in the type of energy that's being used. Energy, whether from renewable sources or from coal power, and you see a big difference. To take that into account when you decide to buy a vehicle, in what country you operate, and what does that mean for, let's say, the electricity, the environmental impact of the electricity produced in your country. So here you see an example, the break-even point for greenhouse gas emissions. And the break-even point is the point where you compensate in your use phase, where you have less carbon emissions, but where you compensate for the higher carbon emission in production phase. And if you charge electric vehicle with solar, that's already after 18,000 kilometers. But for example, if you drive it in Lebanon, then it's only after 45,000 kilometers that you have compensated for the higher carbon emission at production site. And had one of the reports, and it's available, the report, we will send it to you as well after this webinar. It also said, in some cases, like in Lebanon, it might be very interesting also to look at smaller vehicles than you use at this moment. And it might have the same, let's say, reduction of emissions than adopting an electric vehicle. Okay, so maybe I try to give you some ideas, some insights, important to understand. So the electric vehicle is not a silver bullet. It's definitely a very good opportunity to reduce emissions, but really look at it. And there's a lot of things you need to take into account. Like we said, it's look at the type of electricity or the way that electricity is produced in your country. Look at if it's possible to have a charging infrastructure, if it's possible to have after sales and warranty in the country that you operate. So it's not an easy, it's a complex equation. It's not a silver bullet, but don't run away from it, because it's a great opportunity to substantially reduce the emissions of your transport. Okay. Let me see, there are some questions, and we have some time for questions. So, first question, Gilles, talking about local environment, what options for electric vehicles for Africa? Like I said, Gilles, there's in different countries, there are different market situations. Like if you look at a country like Kenya, for example, it's already a bit more mature. So there are some distributors of vehicles who offer electric vehicles. In general, I would say, if you, apart from the market situation, there are not, I think in most places, in urban environments, you can use an electric vehicle, also in Africa. And then indeed, you have to look into what distributors can provide you with an electric vehicle. Osama said, my concern regarding the battery explosion and how to know my choice is correct. Yeah, Osama, there have been some cases of batteries, not so much explosion, but caught fire. It's extremely limited, you know, and there's the whole world is looking at these new types of vehicles. So if there's only one vehicle in the United States where something happens, then the whole world will know it. So I would say, in general, I would say that electric vehicles are extremely safe. So the risk is actually not there, seriously. And how to know my choice is correct, that's based on, you need to set your requirements for what is it that I need and expect from my vehicle. And based on that, do a very proper comparison between different distributors. Sorry, Stuart, what about incentivizing staff to use EV for their commute family use, providing charge point at workplace or discounted free electricity supply? Yeah, I would say that really depends on the fleet policy in organizations. What I really like is if staff uses, let's say, vehicles for commuting, then I would definitely incentivize them to use an electric vehicle instead of an ICE in places where it is possible. So I definitely think that's a great idea. That's what you see, let's say, more in the Western world, so to speak, Europe, US, with people who have company cars, that they are being incentivized for driving an electric vehicle. Yeah. Smart or fast charger? I was talking about smart, and fast is, well, literally what it says. A fast charger is able to charge your vehicle much faster than a normal charger. You have different types. Very good to take into account as well, to discuss with the supplier, is how fast can it charge your vehicle. That's partly to do with the charging station, partly to do with the vehicle, because the vehicle different electric vehicles have different charging times as well. The tool you're talking about, is it supplied by the company selling the chargers? Unfortunately, also here, I don't have a very clear answer. Some suppliers do, some suppliers do not. So it would be good if you reach out to suppliers of charging stations to see if they can provide you with the tools as well, to have the clear insight, to smart charge, but also have the clear insights in charging per moment, per charging event, and link that to the car in your fleet management system. All right. Unfortunately, we have come, let's say, to the end. I already spent 1 more minute. So unfortunately, I cannot answer all questions. If you have really very prominent questions that I did not take into account, just send us an email, and then we can, let's say, offline still answer your question. Okay, thank you very much all for your active participation. Next week, we will have another webinar, which is on, oh, I'm sorry, on benchmarking, showing the benchmark results of 2023. Thank you for today. Have a great rest of the day and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.